Maul is what remains of a high elf civilization located in Ferrolas, now populated by the spirits of long dead high elves and ogres, satyrs and elementals. It's split into three parts as it is now. Maul East, Maul West and Maul North as they were commonly known at the times. You'll know them as different things from the dungeon finders now. The order is a little bit different. If you look at them now, they're quite low level. At the time, they were reasonable to be run at level 16. In fact, Maul North and Maul West were highly desirable to continue to be run even at level 60 until you were in raid gear. Maul West, however, had a locked door across it, so you couldn't access it without either the Crescent Key or without a rogue who'd levelled up their lockpicking. To obtain the Crescent Key, you needed to go into Maul East, and to start off, this little imp chappy here is still there now, and you've probably already seen what happens at the end of this. When you finally confront him, just as then he drops Rum Tum Tuber and the Rum Tum Tuber surprise. He also likely drops demonic runes. These, as well as doing what they say on the tin, restoring mana at the cost of health, were also used in some tailoring patterns, especially involving fell cloth, which sometimes drops in this instance. And he drops the Crescent Key. Of course, now it's useless, but at the time was needed to get into Maul East. This way in was the most common entrance, as it was the most convenient if you were having to ride into Maul, as opposed to sign up for a dungeon finder and just be ported in, as opposed to over there. And because people didn't want to do the whole instance, it was the lowest level of the three parts. They usually just jumped down here, did the compulsory bosses only. Although Hydra Spawn wasn't a compulsory boss as such, he was on the way, so people used to do him anyway. This is the one compulsory boss. Now, although there isn't anything particularly important about this particular boss, other than the fact it dropped some items that some people wanted and had a quest that you'd got from Winter Spring. Now, the other thing I want to show you here is not just the last boss. The last boss is nothing special now. At the time, it was the only reason to come here. Mostly there was energized chestplate that Paladins liked. What we've got in here is just like in Strathern, where there was an element towards the quest to get the dungeon set upgraded from blue to epic. So there's one in here. This time it uses something called the Brazier of Invocation. This summons a number of ghosts. They were tough fights if you didn't know what you were doing, but they also rewarded quite nice items at the time. And this is one of two locations where it still works. I'm just going to set it down here. You can see we get a new boss appear. Now look at this. At the moment, Maul East is now a much lower level zone than it used to be. But you can still see this boss level 60. So, but you can't summon this if you're a low level anyway, so there's no danger of running across it. But you can also see the items it drops. They don't have any particularly new transmogs, but I suppose if you like, I mean, there's nothing special about that one. There are other things that would have that transmog, but I suppose if it's something you want, if you know someone with the brazier, you could just go into Maul and get them to summon the boss and get one of those if you like that. Maul North was the ogre section, and this was all about not killing bosses. It confused the hell out of me when I was levelling up, because I'd be in Ironforge and listening to trade chat, and people would be asking for group members for DM Tribute Run, and I used to think, Dead Mines? Why high level asking for Dead Mines? Because what they meant was Maul Tribute Run. Now, to go along to one of these, you had to have a certain amount of materials or contribute some materials unless the party leader had all of them themselves. This door doesn't work anymore. It's just a bit of scenery. But it used to be functional. You used to be able to go down there to get into the Maul library. You can now only access that library through Maul West. More on that later. So there's a boss. So normally I would just go down this way. I will now because I'm high level and I won't aggro him. But we didn't used to go this way because, as I said, what we wanted to do was not kill bosses. We'd sneak past Stomper Creek. We wouldn't go through the middle there because there was a boss that patrolled there. He could patrol around lots of places. So we had to be on the lookout. Always pulling things back to us rather than doing what I'm doing and rushing into them for fear that a boss patrol would come along. We absolutely had to not aggro it. So we can see another boss. Obviously at this point we'd have to stay well back, wait till he'd finished until we were absolutely certain we weren't going to aggro him before we pull the next pack, and of course we would pull it back. But that was fairly standard practice for mobs anyway then. And then quickly before he came back we'd duck into here and through this door. The next step was fairly involved. There's a boss that patrols around here. We'd have to be very, very careful not to pull. But at the same time, we did need to pull these before we could mess about with the trap. I wouldn't aggro them. But of course, they would be aggroed. So you'd pull something and run all the way back to make sure that the guard that we want to trap didn't get aggroed into the bargain. And then we would set this trap here. Now you don't need any materials for it. It did need materials including frost oil. There we go, trapped. Then there's this little chappie over here. It's very important to free him. He did two things. One, he allowed you to bring him certain materials and fashion the Gordok Ogre suit, which was needed for another boss. But the other thing is, once you did free him with the Gordok shackle key, which you could get off certain mobs in here, he left behind a crate which you could loot. There was a small chance in this crate that there would be an epic tailoring or leatherworking pattern. It gave access, for example, to the Hide of the Wild, which was the must-have healing cloak right up until the end of Blackwing Lair. Sometimes beyond. And here's the tanning basket, and of course we've got the Silence of the Lambs reference here. Which we return back to the Goblin. Again, just to note that all he wants now is the tanning, but at the time there were a number of other materials, including rune cloth, before he would give you the Gordok Ogre suit. You had to remember to get the suit off him before you freed him, because as soon as you freed him, he was off, he was gone. You can't free him now. Of course, the dungeon is set up for people who are just signing up to it in the LFD and coming straight into it. You're not obviously going to be carrying around those materials. You wouldn't even know what they were for. Coming to the final room, it's the usual thing of pulling trash right back so you didn't aggro the boss at the end. In fact, the boss at the end was the one that was most fun. Everyone would pack themselves in here so as not to aggro it. Whoever had the Gordok suit would put this on. And, oh my god, I love coming in here just to put this on, I have to say. This is like the best feature of it. But that's enough of that. In order to get past this boss, of course, there's no sneaking past it, so we have to tell him to go away. And we tell him that another one of the bosses has called him like a ladyboy or something. Off he goes. And then we'd all carry on our merry way. As soon as he'd gone past, of course. And then finally, we have the end boss himself. And what we'd usually do is get someone to tank the observer elsewhere. Of course, I'm just going to kill the boss there. Done. There we go. I'm just going to make him bring up the tribute. There we go. And this just used to have better loot. The bosses, you'll probably notice yourself if you've been through it. Oh, hello. That's a bit of a bonus. We've even got one of the very, very rare epics. But the quality of the loot was just simply better. There was something called Rod of the Magi, which mages in particular really, after even high level, even level 60 mages would go mad for that. We're going to take that. Scarab Plate Helm, I remember that as a paladin. And all we'd do once we'd finished this tribute run is to go through all the bosses and we would pick up some buffs. Although these bosses don't grant buffs now, they used to be able to give you attack power and stamina and spell crits. They lasted for 2 hours. And as an aside, we used to use these when we were well into Nax Ramus. The original Lotheb was a very tough DPS check, extremely tough, to the point where we'd spend 2 hours buffing up. And one of the things we would do is a Maul tribute run to get those buffs. Maul West was the highest level of the instances and the one for which you needed a key even to get into it. As a result, it was often run more frequently than the others, with the potential exception of the tribute run if you were doing North as opposed to doing it the normal way. One boss that wasn't essential but you would do, generally speaking, if there was a healer in the party that didn't have the item yet, was this guy. And the reason people didn't like doing this because he mind controlled. But unfortunately he hasn't dropped it here. He used to drop something called the Mind Map Talisman, which you still can, which was absolutely God healer trinket until you were into raiding. And as I've said in my last video, even when you got into raiding, trinkets didn't come thick and fast. If you've ever killed this boss but you haven't played since vanilla times, you'll probably be a bit confused about something when he dies. And that is what this ghost horsey is. It was an important part of the Paladin Mount quest. At level 60, most classes had to save up 1,000 gold to, unless of course they had rep with a faction that made it a little bit cheaper, to get the epic riding mount. Paladins and Warlocks got quests. It still often ended up being just as expensive, but it meant they got their own version of the mount. And for both it meant coming into Maul East. After killing the final boss, this was the scene for the final part of the Warlock's Epic Mount quest and involved quite a tough encounter, after which they'd be able to pick it up. Very few people actually did this unless it was specifically for the mount, because it was pretty tough. The Athenaeum. There's a number of points of interest in here. The first one, as I was levelling up, even as a paladin I was a tailor, but that's because I was an enchanter as well. And you could get from him the mooncloth robe. I used to actually make quite a bit of gold off that for quite a little while. You also, if you talk to some of these guys, they talk about tomes that have gone missing. Now, there were two main types of tomes that you could turn into these guys. One were for the Libra that I mentioned in the Strathome video, where if you turned it in with the right materials as well, which would involve gathering things from other dungeons, you could get an Arcanum which you could use to enchant either your leg or your head, depending on which type you had. But there were also class-specific tomes that would get you a blue quality trinket, such as this one here. This is the one I've got for the Paladin. So it was a place people came to a fair amount. And you could get rep with these guys as well. You can, I mean, they're neutral to me. I didn't actually really bother. But if you turned in lots of tomes, you could get rep with them. We can see there it still exists. It's just because the tomes don't exist, there's no way, as far as I know at any rate, to increase that reputation. One final encounter was actually outside of the instances, and between them in this arena there was a rare boss that periodically spawned and drops decent blue BOEs. You even got a shout about it if you were in the instance itself, and when that shout went out you'd run out and hopefully you'd be the group that get to tag it and defeat it. So those are the elements of Maul that are still sort of in, just to make sense of them from what they were like during vanilla times. Now, if you liked the video, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. If you didn't like it, don't forget to comment why. and there will be others in the series coming up on a weekly basis.